I'm here representing you initially, and shortly you will be asking questions directly. There will be microphones handed out, but to get the discussion started, I have a question for you all, which is, in some way or another, you have all touched upon the history of the internet and the wisdom of crowds is something that grows out of that history, of course. And the conference, however, is about the future of the forum. So I would like to know a little bit more about what your utopias are, and based on the notion of the histories of the wisdom of crowds, I have this concern that do we know, as members of the crowd, what the crowd is up to? This morning I encountered an ant, and the ant said to me, "Oh, I'm going to tell everybody that there's sugar on the breakfast table." And I said, "I don't think so." The conversation was very short. And what we did, what I was wondering then is if the ant actually knows about its state in the hive. Is the ant aware of the hive? And similarly, are we aware of our position in the crowd? Do we know what we're doing when we're part of a crowd? Are we aware of our mission?
You've got these little things which change crowds dramatically.
Yes?
Well, you know, so I paid a pilgrimage to Bob Axelrod when I was at the University of Michigan. He wrote The Evolution of Cooperation, and he gave me a koan. He said, there have been all of these massive political demonstrations at that time. It was happening in Ukraine, it was happening in Beirut. He said, these are parts of the world in which you don't see peaceful demonstrations. To say nothing of the fall of communism, which had a great deal to do with people going out in the streets when they had been afraid to go out in the streets for a long time. He said, why are they peaceful? And I believe one reason is that the crowd, you used to be dissolved in the crowd. The crowd was faceless. The person next to you was not going to hold you responsible for what you did later. I'm sure many of you were at the futile demonstrations before the Iraq War. I was there with my friends because we called each other. We sent each other messages. I called my daughter. I said, you really should see this. She said, well, how will I find you? I said, go to downtown San Francisco and call me. And so I think that, and now, you know, the ability for us to not only coordinate geographically, but coordinate socially, I think is an important element. Not a panacea, does not make a crowd any less dangerous than it was. Well, I think it's a little bit like putting some moderating rods in the nuclear reactor, but I think there are good reasons to be fearful of large gatherings of strangers.
Right, but we are no longer faceless. In fact, the Iranian government is now identifying people who are participating in protests, and when they arrive at Iran's borders, they have the files and all the details. So we are indeed quite literally no longer faceless. Any more comments about the awareness, self-awareness?
I would make a couple of distinctions when it comes to crowds. We used to talk about the madness and the delusion of crowds, but there's also the wisdom of crowds. Another distinction is synchronous versus asynchronous participation of crowds. Asynchronous, you have something wonderful like Wikipedia where people are contributing over time and checks and balances against each other. A synchronous crowd, that's, you think of a mob of 10,000, 100,000 people in one place. That's kind of unpredictable. Sometimes good things happen, sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes very good things, sometimes very bad things. But in terms of managing both of those, I think that we're in a technological age and tools can be developed by smart people to give us the best, hopefully the best of those two worlds. And I try to be an optimist like Howard because it's very depressing to be anything else.
So I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I think it's also, Howard was talking primarily about real-world crowds, and right now there's a tremendous amount of virtual world crowds that we have very little sense of. There was, a lot of people in writing that there's a live stream here, and someone wrote to me saying, "I see you," but we have no idea what crowd might be outside even of this very room. There could be 2 people watching. There could be 200,000. We have no idea, and so. So I think one of the big pieces for the future is the ability to depict both individuals online, but also to give people a much better sense of where there are crowds. How many other people are reading this article that you're reading? What's the scale of the audience for your remarks? And then how we depict that, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting decisions to be made, because with any of these, for instance, the privacy aspects, in the offline world, it's very hard to hide your identity in the crowd unless we all go to demonstrate with paper bags over our heads. But if we choose to design interfaces for online crowds, we can ask even these fundamental questions of, do we want to see a crowd but not be able to individually identify people, but be able to see something, for instance, about what they've had to say, their type, but not their specific individual identity. So that question of how we can sort of invent what is a crowd of virtual humans is a big piece of that future.
Thank you. Jimmy?
I was just going to say there's this question when we talk about smart mobs or wisdom of crowds, it's always important to recognize these are very broad terms which we often try to over-apply to too many different kinds of phenomenon, and we can lose a lot of understanding of what's really going on if we don't differentiate a fair amount. So for example, as a user of Craigslist, I occasionally see something that looks like spam to me, so I click on flag. Very rarely. I click on flag. I help out, right? I flag it, right? I report it. But I'm not logged in. I'm not anybody. In this case, I'm just a member of the crowd, the general public, and I'm just trying to pitch in. It takes me a click to sort of let them know, and after so many people report it, it gets taken down, and the people, I don't even know how it works exactly, but then it mostly works, and it keeps the thing from being overwhelmed by nonsense. So this is really great. When we think about what's going on at Wikipedia, it's very, very different from that. It's typically what is, everybody is aware of very, very famous sort of articles like Barack Obama, which has had hundreds or even thousands of people editing it, lots of people looking at it, lots of people in dialogue. That's an interesting case, but that's a very strange case actually for Wikipedia. The typical discussion in Wikipedia is 3 or 4 people in a community, people who know each other, and they've worked together in different areas, or they know each other from different ways. They can reach out to other people in the community if they're having a conflict, they're having trouble solving. Usually an administrator will come up and sort of help them try to find some common ground and so forth. But it's a very, very human process. And so it's very different from a mob or a crowd phenomenon. It's a small community phenomenon. And so I think we just have to be careful, I think, about lumping too many different kinds of things together.
Yeah, there's a whole discipline there that needs to be opened up. Mitch?
I would be cautious about, my hunch is there will be in the not too distant future a continuing series of new technological disruptions that will alter the landscape that we are familiar with yet again and again and again. And it's material to this whole discussion. My evidence for that is that nobody envisioned anything like Wikipedia, really, or Craigslist for that matter, or e-commerce actually. If you just go back really a decade or two, before the technology emerged that made it possible. It just is not really within the realm of human conception to understand what people will do with new technological affordances when you've got a 50% or more annual exponential growth in capabilities. And I think that's the good news and the bad news. Some things that we see as problems today sort of are going to go away, and others are going to get much, much worse. The only problem is it's very difficult to tell which things are going to be in which. And it leaves everybody with a practical stake in this, who's a pragmatist, who wants to use the technology to do something in a somewhat awkward kind of position. But I would say it, to me, let's not be utopian at all. We're just not smart enough. Let's think about where we are today. Let's look at what seem to be the real fundamental issues or problems or concerns, and they will of course be different to different people, with different interests and stakes. And let's understand how we, with some degree of confidence, might envision doing something with each other in now and in the near term that could make a difference of nudging things. So for instance, and I'll conclude with this, a few years ago, and it was really just a few years ago, and when I first met Jimmy and we were talking, there was a lot of discussion about could Wikipedia be sustained or would it collapse in on itself? That was really a live question. And I think now that's not a live question. There are other very important questions about Wikipedia, but it has passed through that period of crisis into something else. And I don't know what the story is with Craigslist, but in each form, none at all. So let's not be utopian. I like what Howard had to say, and let's not be too theoretical about it either. Let's understand, this is my very personal interest, how to take valuable insights and research and do something with them that actually makes a difference today, tomorrow, next year, or the year after.
Okay, thank you. So one thing that is challenging, though, in this space is that information changes its value over time. For example, Van Jones at some point signed a petition, and now he had problems with that because later on that signature carried a great weight and prevented him from pursuing his career at the White House. So things we do today may have different meanings in the future, and we keep track of those things. So we are now members of crowds with histories and with trackable activities. How does that affect our sense of responsibility for what we're building? In other words, what are our strategies for dealing with the potential change in the value of information? Is it true that you had a campfire last night in 2009? How could you do a campfire in 2009? Off to jail 1 month, you know. It could be like that. Something that seems completely innocuous now has a different meaning in the future. How do we account for that?
Did you ask me?
No, no.
Okay. One of the phrases I use in the book that I'm writing is history is the equivalent of the body in cyberspace. And it becomes something that you really, really value, that you need to take care of, that can betray you over time. And how we think of these information bodies will have a tremendous impact on what kind of future that we have. I think Howard touched on some of this with these questions of who's looking at us. So for instance, there's a big difference in your concerns about privacy when it's from a neighbor or a friend who you want to see one side of yourself but not another, versus a repressive government looking in on you. Right. And so I think one of the most fundamental questions in how people can participate is going to be around that control of information. What control do you have of the information that is about you? Is it that everything is there, it's accessible to everyone with no nuance? Or is it something that you can have some kind of privacy control over? We've all seen how awkward, for instance, Facebook's controls are, but there's a little bit there. We also don't know, for instance, people are spending enormous amounts of time putting up photos, reminiscences, engaging in these dialogues. But Facebook is a private company. One day they might decide maybe they'll get religion. Maybe they'll join a cult and say, this was a bad idea, we're closing down, and it will all disappear. So it's a huge history that people are building that's somebody else's private property. And so I think one of the tremendous issues is both how we look at these information bodies. So for instance, right now you have a mirror so that when you went out this morning, you probably have some idea of how you look. But we don't really have mirrors for our information about what kind of impression are we building up, whether it's through our credit card records, the things that we said, the pictures that other people have posted of us. So one thing we need is this kind of data mirror to see how we can shape what impression others are having of us. But we also need to understand what are both the technological, the legal, and the social controls over how to maintain something we're very accustomed to now in the physical world, which is a nuanced identity where we can present different things in different contexts to different people, which is a very, very hard problem in the world of Google and instantly tieable information.
Thank you. Data mirrors, can we build those?
You know, it's not just the information that you disclose about yourself. I still encounter a certain degree of surprise by students about how their activities online come back to haunt them. But that curve has definitely changed a great deal since the first Facebook class, who were shocked by their drunken photos having an effect on their graduate school or employment admissions. That has definitely changed. It's certainly not universal that people are aware of the consequences of what they do online, but there's also what other people do. I spoke to a young man whose ambition was to be a hacker for the NSA, and he had spent a lot of time trying to not be on the internet, but he has no control over other people taking photographs of him and tagging him. Of course, you can go and detag those if you know about them, if they're on Facebook. But increasingly, we've got, I think, somewhere around 200 million camera phones in the world now, and there's no sense making any phones without cameras from now on, and they're all going to be connected to the internet from now on, and automatic facial recognition is here now. I'm not building up to a solution here. I'm just pointing out that the problem's not only our own self-control.
In the introduction, he said something like, "Don't take any photos if you can help it," or something. And I thought, it is sort of accidental these days. The cameras are everywhere.
In fact, there's no real way of telling if this thing is on or off. So, and bearing in mind that your future depends on questions you ask right now, are there any questions in the audience that you would like to bring to our panel? Nicola, yes.
Hi, I'm Nicholas DiMancio. I work with the Center for New Media. I'm in architecture, and I wanted to pick up on some of the historical references and point out that the first thing the Romans did when they took over Athens was wall off the Agora and make it into a closed Roman forum. And the Agora is an interesting potential metaphor because it was actually part of a tripartite division of urban space and social space in Greek society, and the Agora was the public forum that helped mediate the other two, bring the other two fora into everyday life, and those were respectively the Acropolis, or the space of ethics, and the Necropolis, or the space of history. And Jim spoke about the role of history as being a particularly relevant mode of discussion for the way in which Wikipedia operates as an agora, bringing it into contemporary life. But I wanted to throw that back to this tripartite division, back to the panel, and talk about how ethics and history, which are two things that we don't necessarily associate with digital fora, are both potentially threatened in public life or been potentially exposed as opportunities, as Jim was talking about in the development of these electronic media in the next decades.
So how does history and ethics form your design of future media fora? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think for me, one of the, I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but one of the things is that building productive communities that are doing healthy and useful things, whether it's building an encyclopedia or building a healthy public discourse around public policy, it doesn't happen automatically. And this is one of the reasons that I really resist a lot of the terminology about crowds and mobs, because there's nothing wrong with that terminology in identifying certain phenomena, but the danger of it is people begin to think that these things sort of magically or automatically emerge, when very often they're the product of a very deliberate cultivation of a culture, but also the design of the software heavily impacts the level and the kinds of discourse. From things like, at Wikipedia we have social rules like no personal attacks, but we also have the tools in the community to temporarily block people if they're not doing the right things. And we have social rules about how to appeal that. Or on Facebook, you can, if somebody's being annoying on your wall, you just unfriend them or what have you. These are the tools that we're beginning to develop. But I think we have a lot to learn about how do we develop these tools going forward to ensure that we do have healthy... history and ethics and that sort of thing.
Trust is a crucial matter there as well. How can you trust those tools? How much do we know about them? You mentioned that when you flag something on Craigslist, you assume that it works somehow, and we of course all trust that it has an effect, but it could be just an icon you click on with no effect at all, right? and it's hard to know these things. So the question is, do we build trust through social mechanisms or through technical mechanisms or through a particular combination of both?
And there's all kinds of interesting, very complex problems of balancing transparency and privacy.
Right.
And so our main method for ensuring that you trust Wikipedia is that it's pretty darn transparent. If you want to know how did this article get to this stage, you click the history, it's all there, and who did what and all this. Except that occasionally people are posting things that are serious privacy violations. Posting somebody's home phone number or something like this in an argument. And we actually delete that in such a way that the public can't see it. But you have to trust us that we're not sort of mysteriously cleaning up the history of things we don't like or something like this. And well, we have mechanisms for helping you trust us for that, but it's complicated.
It's endless. More questions on this side of the room, perhaps? Back there, gentleman with the jacket. Reese.
Hi, I'm Reese. Most of you touched on sort of the history versus the present of public forums. And one of the big distinctions, I think, electronically is that people can be anonymous, and the technology keeps getting better to be more and more anonymous. And in anonymity, you can attack people or push a point of view that's very difficult to respond to, where historically journalists and public forums and people having debates in public or in person, there's their reputation and their personal self there to stand behind their words. And so that's a change that is putting both Wikipedia at risk, Craigslist at risk, and everything on the internet at risk.
And that question is for all of you?
I didn't hear a question mark.
Yeah,
on there,
yeah.
but,
Well, you could say things about anonymity. We've struggled with that a little bit. It's a very complex question. In some contexts, anonymity is very, very good. Other contexts, it's very, very bad. I think the challenge is over time, and I don't think we're anywhere near there, is better tools to manage anonymity and whatever the antonym of anonymity is.
Identity.
So I'll say for Wikipedia, I don't feel like we're under any particular threat from anonymity. And I don't see any trend on the internet in general in a direction that would threaten to undermine the way Wikipedia functions with respect to people being anonymous or not anonymous. It just is not a big deal for us.
Another concern is fake identity, right? If you use somebody else's identity. Go ahead. Question on this side of the room. Cecil?
Thank you. Hi. My name is Cecil. And this question is for, I guess, the whole panel. My concern is with the difference between orality, oral cultures, and literacy. As you all know, the biggest and the most important technology is not the electric one that we live in, but the one we just passed, which is the writing technology. And for 400 years, since the Gutenberg and the print technology, the domination of world culture has been by people who possess this technology. So that the slave trade was dominated by white men who controlled the technology. And McLuhan's idea, I think in the Playboy interview in 69, was incredibly prophetic, because he talked about the internet as if it were already there. But when he died in 1980, we were just experiencing the beginning of the word processor in the computer. So McLuhan thought that the whites who had dominated the world so long with this technology were now yielding something that they couldn't control, which was the interfacing between the technology of the computer or electric technology plus the orality.
So your question?
So I'm getting to it.
Yeah.
One other black person here, so
No,
I think
go for it. I'm curious.
We live in a time when the President of the United States is seen to be more in tune with the digital technology than most of us. And so my question, to get to the question, is this, that isn't it true that there is a residual leavings of this oral culture that is much more powerful, as it turns out, than the literate culture? So that you have to ask yourself, are we simply taking over the function of the literate technology, which was to control and to control the world, essentially? And you all know this because of the technology of literacy dominated the slaves and the slave trade and so forth. My question is, are we experiencing a handing over from the English departments, from the literate institutions, to a new mastery of the public sphere by the oral, not oral, but the digital electric?
And in a sense,
in other words,
in a sense, it's the digital another oral performance that is now connecting to the written performance.
And the reason why it takes a long time is that we need classes to address these questions, and we don't have them.
Right.
When people fund organizations, they don't fund, the crucial element is what's happening to our African American people. Why aren't they present? Why aren't they on these forums and so forth? It's a really large question, so I appreciate you allowing me to take the time, because it needs to be addressed. And I'm sorry if I, sort of extrapolated. Thank you.
It's welcome. Thanks. Let's hear the panel's response.
Let me try to shed light just on part of this. The underlying technologies of computers and networks have really done their best job about taking stuff that used to be on paper and now doing it digitally and online. And so it's favored all of those, not exclusively, but to a very large degree, written media have been their analogs in the digital world have been the dominant ones. And that is in the process of changing and going to change very dramatically with, I think, unpredictable results, because there will be enough processing power in the CPUs and enough bandwidth in the networks and enough underlying foundational software and three-dimensional computer graphics and so on and so on and so forth, that what you'll get for your $100 smartphone will be much more capable of rendering something that is an analog to a face-to-face, real-time, three-dimensional presence, as well as other things we can't even imagine. And so it's going to rebalance the scales in a way that's very different. And I'm talking 5, 10, 20 years, our lifetimes, next, not 50 or 100 years. And so I would say the current set of power arrangements is going to really be challenged by that. And those people who figure out how to take advantage of that, for better or for worse, are going to increase their power when you can do real-time 3D, when you can augment reality. Take this 3D terrestrial reality and put stuff in it that feels real and acts like it's real, but it isn't. It's a projection from the imagination. That's a significant shift in ground rules. And if I've done one thing well in my career, it's to spot the next big disruptive trend, from the PC to the internet to open source software to virtual and so on. And I think we should take your question in that context and not get too wedded to how things are right now, but to think a lot about what might be. And as Alan Kay said, is reputed to have said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it.
Thank you. Jimmy?
I was just going to make a quick observation that basically just echoing part of what you said. If you take a look at Wikipedia, its connection to what came before is fairly obvious. We had Britannica, now we have Wikipedia, and its it's a very self-consciously similar. It's not exactly the same, of course. But then we have things like Twitter, for example, which is not the parallel of anything that we used to have, other than maybe conversation. But even that, it's not exactly. I don't know if we can say, oh yeah, my grandmother used to do X, and now she does Twitter. Right now we're doing Twitter. But the thing I wanted to note, and this is something that I've observed, and I don't have any conclusions about it. It's just something I've observed. If you go to Twitter and you look at the trending topics and you click on several of the trending topics, you will see certain topics that are heavily dominated by black teenagers. That community is coming online and using Twitter in a way that we haven't seen them editing Wikipedia and doing other kinds of things. That seems relevant to your comment and question, although I have no conclusions about it. It's just an observation.
So new media include new people, new voices.
Sometimes.
Judith? Yeah? Sometimes. They can.
And
Judith?
I just want to get back to the beginning of your question on sort of the move from orality to a written culture, because I think one of the big hallmarks of it is the change in the role of memory, because our oral culture is very much based on memory. You don't have something written down. You don't have an external, this is the right version of the Bible, this is the right version of the Iliad. It's a constant retelling, and whoever retells it is the person in charge of it at that moment. And the huge difference with a written culture is you then have authoritative versions of it. And so looking at that axis at digital media, there's the question about how do they change from being like the written word only done with electrons, which, as Jimmy was saying, Wikipedia is different than Britannica in the collaboration that goes into making it, but the actual product is not all that different from what we're used to in an encyclopedia. But one of the big differences is there going to be a huge fracturing of that notion of control over memory and history, so that even a little bit with Wikipedia of saying every country may have its own version of this history is one version of it, and certainly there's a lot more fracturing of it. But I think it's a very interesting lens for looking at that the fundamental change from written to digitally written.
Could I just,
One more point. This is a great question. You have so many answers.
He had a point that my reading of information technology and networking to date is that it has arguably expanded the digital divide more than leveling the playing field. It is certainly very hard, to be convinced, and I'm not convinced, that all this wonderful technology has narrowed the digital divide. It's like the early adopters and techno pioneers who tend to be from the more upper strata, well-educated. Jimmy's remarks notwithstanding, which I find interesting, I want to look into. But what I see is lots of instances in which things are centrifugally sort of pulling apart and divisions are increasing, not decreasing. As I said, that's a snapshot. I'm reluctant to overgeneralize, but I think there is a distressing tendency still in the circles that I travel in to have a kind of an unconscious assumption that there's a sort of an inherent leveling that comes with all this wonderful technology because it is so personal, so individual, it's getting cheaper and so on. And I really think we ought to be extraordinarily skeptical of that.
Okay, Jim?
Yeah, I was going to say some important questions were raised. I'd say a couple of things that, one of the things that has progressed in society over the last 2,500 years in the history of the forum, today there at least is a recognition that disenfranchisement, racism, classism, the perpetual attempts of the rich and powerful to stay that way and keep anyone who isn't that way down and out. There at least today is a recognition that that's a bad thing. Doesn't necessarily mean that we are particularly effective in addressing those issues, but I think there is a widespread recognition and an attempt to do the right thing. And the other thing I was going to add, that amongst technologists there are a couple of laws that illustrate why those disenfranchisement doesn't just hurt the disenfranchised, it hurts those who are doing the disenfranchisement. Power law and Metcalfe's law, which both in different ways say that the more people who are fully participating, the better the overall product that everyone enjoys is. And when you disenfranchise, whether it's on a personal level or even on a business level where entrenched, the biggest corporations get with the powers in government to keep small business down and to keep their entrenched position. That's very damaging to society. Any kind of disenfranchisement is, I think, and I really appreciated your question.
Thank you. All right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm curious, change the situation just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about how business fits in this. Jim, I think, and maybe you could speak to this, but Craigslist, I think, at least led to the change of traditional media in classified ads, etc. And so I'm curious about, in terms of the forum, the discussions, and what we've been talking about is public policy, kind of general discourse, but how does business fit into this forum, the future of the forum? How does business extract the good and deal with the bad or negative, separate from that kind of public policy, or are they kind of one and the same?
Well, I grappled on to something you said in the first part of that question that I'll speak to, because that's what's in my head, is that, so the role of Craigslist Classified and classifieds in general online, much has been written about how that has cut out some of the underpinnings of the press, journalism, mainstream media. And I think this ties into our topic today. In many ways, down through history, the forum and grassroots democracy has been a much more powerful force, and I think it has a lot more potential than what's typically called the fourth estate, namely kind of powerful media, to counterbalance those things in our society that most need counterbalancing. Very rich media, rich in terms of money, not in the technology sense, become very risk averse, and they have reasons why they're not going to touch. They may touch on, but they're not going to fully explore those areas that society most badly needs their kind of advocacy on. The forum can do that. It's not reaching its potential in that regard yet. The internet forum is still very young. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential. That might be the area where there's the most potential. And whether we'll get to user-generated governance or not, we certainly have a lot of user-generated content now, but perhaps, maybe it will.
Thank you. That sounds great. One more question in the back of the room there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Barbara Grobe, Director of Communications for the Human Rights Center here at UC Berkeley, and also a co-sponsor of the forum event today. I have a question for you guys about your sense of how governable anything is with the forum as it is.
How governable is the forum? Are you referring to the forum itself, or the forum as an agency for governing other things?
Attempting to administer anything.
Oh, with the forum, or yeah?
We have progressed from actual assassinations like Julius Caesar in the Roman Forum in 44 BC to just having character assassination today, which is a little more manageable and governable.
I think things are quite governable. I mean, Wikipedia is open, diverse, participatory, and has a very large number of rules. I remember when I did first meet Mitch, he did a very deep study of Wikipedia, and at the time he told me he printed out about 100 pages of rules of Wikipedia. He's lucky he did it back then, because now it's a few hundred more pages, I'm sure. But it's all about balancing different kinds of concerns, and the community does these things. It's not top down imposed from the top, but it's governable.
Can something like Wikipedia or participatory collaborative culture govern more than itself? Could we have Wikipedia run a department?
I certainly hope not.
I said earlier, but picked an ambitious but solvable problem, which has to do with encyclopedia articles, where you can get people with different interests often to agree on the facts. Mm-hmm. When you move into the normative sphere, and governance is about the normative sphere, what's right, what's not, what shall we do, where shall we commit our resources, it's not, well, the facts, I hope, matter. they're insufficient. There's a question of values, where we want to get to. Wikipedia wisely attempts whenever possible to avoid that because it is a thicket. I mean, it's, you know, when you asked whether the forum was governable, I said, is the U.S. governable? Is the world governable? Actually, right now, not so much. And so I would, you know, again say, let's not cleave off into a separate consideration all this online stuff. Let's join it back to, you know, the world that, the bodies we inhabit and the world we actually live in, and let's figure out how to make our institutions and worlds, whether they're virtual or non-virtual or a hybrid, as I think they're all going to be more governable.
Judith?
Yeah, well, I think another way of phrasing that question might be, what forums are governable? Fora are governable? Because, you know, exactly, Wikipedia is an example of something that is a very well-defined problem, and you can make well-defined rules because you agree on the result. What we have online is the opportunity to design enormous numbers of places like that with different rules that are going to have different effects, and some might be just about, you know, the outpouring of personal opinion, and some might be trying to get a particular result. Some might emphasize responsibility over freedom, etc. And so a lot of it is what we need to be learning over the next few years are what are the elements we put into these designs that lead to different types of situations and different types of relationships among people. And so that's where issues around things like anonymity, which give you a great deal of protection of your privacy, but at the risk of developing a very ungovernable, irresponsible discussion, versus designing other types of spaces and other types of rules and other relationships with history that would give you a different type of forum. So I think it's not so much whether these forums are in theory governable, but what are all the multitudes of governments that we want to be able to create.
One note of caution I would add in terms of the word governable, there's occasionally you'll hear attorneys general, for instance, saying that the internet has now grown up, it's time to regulate it much more heavily. Regulation is a good thing when done deftly. The problem is it's not always done deftly, and on occasion you'll hear rumblings about holding internet organizations responsible for each and everything, the piece of content that they host that's submitted by users. Anything in that direction in terms of regulation and the very existence of a Wikipedia is called into question. And you could kind of say, well, no one would ever do that, of course, but you have to remember that they're very powerful people and institutions that don't particularly appreciate the democratic approach and the full kind of participatory approach. I don't want to be, let's stay on the optimistic note, but it is something, anytime you hear, it's often said in phrases, well, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, it's grown up, but it's time to regulate it more. And often it's on the line of wedge issues. Oh, we have to look out for the children, as Howard mentioned. It's generally going to be a wedge issue where you'll hear this, and just something to keep your ears open for.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Would you like to close with closing statements, Twitter size? Can you do that? About the future of the forum as you see it? What do we need to look out for? A summary, perhaps? What is the most important thing to look out for? Mitch, it seemed like you were focusing on staying focused in the present and not losing your... I think that was a very good one. Thought. Would you like to state that in some other conclusion?
You know, the conversation continues. I could say something, but I've spoken plenty. I yield.
Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in there. There's an assumption behind your question of governance that we wouldn't be here talking about the internet if the fundamental decisions about the architecture had not reserved innovation for the edges. That in fact there was not a central switch that you had to change. You didn't have to ask permission to create something. That is not necessarily going to be the future. And in terms of state regulation, I would say that we are seeing an experiment happening in Iran. We're seeing an experiment happening in China. We're seeing an experiment happening in the USA with the net neutrality debate over whether the amount of lack of governance and lack of control that has enabled things to happen, whether that is going to continue into the future. And I'm not at all certain that it will.
All right.
I just returned to one theme that I thought was interesting, say a couple things more about it. It's the contrast between the glacial and perhaps unchanging human nature that dominates the forum and the unrelenting exponential curve on which technology develops. And theorists there predict that if that curve is unchanging, and it hasn't changed for a long time, every atom of the universe will be saturated with computation within 100 years. So it's interesting to me how those two are going to play out over time. Singularity theorists have said around 2020 or 2025, that's when they're predicting the machines take over. I hope they'll be good to us.
And if anybody wants to put up money on that, I'm happy to take the other side of that bet in any amount. So you let me know.
All right. Any closing comments from you, Jimmy?
Yeah, I'll just say, I always say I'm a carpenter, not an architect. And what I mean by that, it's sort of echoing what Mitch was saying earlier. With the rapid pace of technological change, it's really difficult, even though I'm lucky enough to be in a position where people ask me sort of deep guru questions about the future. It's kind of like, okay, let's keep improving the tools we have, let's keep hammering away, let's try to make things, build healthy communities, but we have to do it with really hammer and nails and really build it. And so it's really hard to forecast sort of the future of the forum.
Thank you, but we'll take small steps towards it. Judith, last comment?
I guess the other question to keep in mind is, what is the whole point of the forum? I mean, it's made out of people. They're coming together to discuss things. And so I think that's the other key element, is to understand that the flip side of the government piece is not just how the forum itself is governed, but how do we move this power of communication and discussion and communitarian action into actually having more effect on the real world, and how will that transition happen? So sort of what is the point of having the forums?
That's a beautiful note to conclude on. Thank you. So let's take this to action.